Well, welcome to Noel's World of Whiskey. I wanted to kind of tackle something different tonight, and I kind of came about it by accident. I was actually doing some research from my previous review on, I think it was the whiskeys of Islay, and then we were going to get off Islay and look at some of our peated whiskeys that we have, you know, on the islands other than Islay, you know, the Orkneys, Islay, Varan, Skye, and also on the mainland of Scotland. And in the process, while I was looking, you know, a lot of distilleries came up. I know some of them, and some of them not that familiar with. And I started going down this rabbit hole, and it was amazing the number of distilleries that I found that I didn't know. So, you know, as I keep doing my research, I get into one of my more favorite writers, Charlie MacLean. I like reading some of his articles. And this one, I think, dated back to 2016. I've actually got the article here, and it's quite interesting. And where this kind of goes is, with all these distilleries, are we getting into another Whisky Loch? Now this could have been a current article that I read, except I looked at the date on it and looked at the numbers he was making on the number of operating distilleries and the research I did. And that's how I found that it was an older article. And I'll kind of give you a bit of an idea what it was all about. I mean, he sort of gets a bit into the history. Charlie MacLean talked a lot about, you know, a bit of a concern of this incredible expansion. We basically have gone through these boom and bust periods historically, and there's three key periods. And he talks about these periods, and he talked, of course, about the first one. And that was after the Excise Act in 1823, and this was the opportunity for distilleries to go to be legalized and get licensed, because it was now affordable to make whiskey. And so, you know, at that time, and between 1823 and 1834, there was 260 licenses that were taken out. That's in that decade. Now, a lot of these were previously illegal distilleries, so it's not like we built 260, but there still was a good number that were built. And, you know, a lot of them didn't make it. A lot of them didn't survive in the first few years. But the interesting thing is, of the 260 distilleries that were licensed, there was only 20 of them in existence today. So we saw obviously a drop in the success as we head through the mid 1800s, and we work our way to the second boom. And the second boom, it happened in the 1890s. And there was 40 new distilleries built in the 1890s. And I noticed that a lot of the research I did, you know, there's, you know, some of our, you know, some of the reviews I did, and of course the historically a lot of them were built just prior to the crash, the Patterson crash. It is a period of time when we had an overstock of whiskey, and Patterson was a bit of a crook, and he basically had a huge effect on the let's put it this, the stability of the industry at the turn of the 19th century. So we're looking at some 40 distilleries. I believe 24 of them were from Speyside. And the interesting thing there is that Islay had, you know, it had a handful of distilleries, but Campbelltown was really the whiskey capital of the planet. And there was over 30 distilleries in Campbelltown alone. And what happened in Campbelltown was they started to produce the whiskey too fast, called hot distilling. The quality of the whiskey went down. They were trying to keep up to the market, and they let the quality go. And that's where the Speyside suddenly kind of took over as the key area to produce whiskey. Their whiskey was a much higher quality, and so 24 of those 40 distilleries built in the 1890s were in the Speyside area. And the interesting thing is, after the Patterson crash, and there were other factors too, I mean, it wasn't just that, but as we got into the 1900s, we were getting into prohibition. The lobbyist and of course the anti-liquor people. It was just a tough period. Economics, World War I, and of course the Depression, and all these things, had a factor on, we'll say, the success of a lot of those distilleries trying to survive. It was a tough period after the turn of the 20th century, 1900s. A lot of these distilleries basically were really struggling to stay alive. So now we get into the third whiskey boom, and that is from 1955 to 1975. And in that period, there was 24 new distilleries that were built. And actually, all but 6 of these are still in production today. The interesting thing is the 80s were a tough period on we call it the Whisky Loch, overproduction. A lot of those distilleries at that time, of course, were built to help with the blended whiskeys. So when they overstocked, they had this huge lake of whiskey. They couldn't sell the whiskey, and there was other reasons too. Drinks like vodka got popular, and whiskey just wasn't. It wasn't the stylish thing to do as it was in the past. It wasn't hip, and we saw a big decline in the whiskey production during that time. So then we get into 2000. And that's where it gets interesting. And of course, Charlie MacLean talks about this huge production that happens in 2000. And, I actually made a list of some of the distilleries that were built in 2000. Because a lot of distilleries that were, mothballed prior to that, they actually, some of them were revived. And the first one, of course, I mentioned, it was around 2000, was Bladnoch. And of course, what had happened, a lot like what had happened to Campbelltown, where they lost all but 3 distilleries, actually all but 2 distilleries. I think it was just Springbank and of course Glen Scotia. We got to remember, there was 34, 35 distilleries there in the 1800s. And so the lowlands got hit too, and the lowlands had numerous distilleries. They were down to, they had, Bladnoch was in existence before 2000, so it was basically Glenkinchie and Auchentoshan. And we'll say Glengoyne is on that boundary line, so even though they have their warehouses in the lowland, their whiskey is made in the highlands. So what happens in 2000? We get that third lowland distillery started up again after being mothballed. And then, of course, the Cinderella story, Brookladdock, which we have, of course, Jim McEwen and Mark Rainier, and of course that was the movie Water of Life, and very fantastic documentary by the way, if you get a chance to see that. And then, of course, 2004, Springbank gets Glengyle up and operating, and the old distillery of Glengyle. And that's your Kilkerran whiskey. And then we get Kilcolman in 2005, the farm distillery, on Islay. And that was the first distillery, I believe, probably in 100 years on Islay, which now is the most, at this time, was the most northerly distillery in Thurso. And then we finally get farther north than the Orkneys. So we no longer can say that Highland is the most northerly, Highland Park's the most northerly distillery. Now we have Saxford up in the Shetlands in 2015. But that was as far as I wanted to go, because then it goes crazy. And so what I did was I produced part of the video, a list, and it goes right back to when Bladnoch, in 2000. It basically, at that time, the turn of the century, it comes back to life. And I give you a list of all those distilleries, and also the ones to come. What's next? An explosion of these distilleries being built. And so, and it's not just in Scotland. Also, this is happening in Ireland. It's happening in North America here, in the States, in Canada. So many in the States. It's going to be a whole different review to cover the ones in the States. But I think what is more important is the fact that Scotland can trigger off, you can trigger off a boom or a bust. There's more distilleries in Scotland than anywhere in the world. And it's affected literally, it's had an influence on distilleries in Japan, in Taiwan, in India, in Germany. You've got new single malt distilleries in Belgium, Holland. It's really, really expanded the number of distilleries around the planet. But the biggest explosion has been in Scotland. And I would say that because it would take me too long to mention them all, and you might find it boring too. So what I did was I did a presentation that I'm going to let you take a look at, and maybe you'll get the impact that I got when I started doing my research. You just see, holy my God. And then there's the ones in the works. So. But I'm going to say no more. I'm going to leave it at that. But there is a question I'm going to ask, is because we don't really have a canary in the mine here. How do we know when we're approaching a whiskey loch? How do we know when it's going to crash? And I'm sort of asking you, are we approaching another whiskey loch? Because we do know that this is a cyclical industry. The whiskey industry, it does its ups and it does its downs. And so are we approaching another whiskey loch with all these distilleries that are being built? Anyways, I'm going to leave that with you, and I'm going to let you watch my presentation of all the distilleries that have opened up in Scotland since 2000. When I say all of them, all the distilleries that I found in my research, I am certain I've missed a few. So enjoy. So as we're finishing up here, again, the question is, are we approaching another Whisky Loch? I don't know if you found that that presentation of, I think there's 54 distilleries there that are actually operating that I showed you since 2000, starting with Bladnoch there, finishing with Port Ellen. And then I think there's another 10 there that are proposed. And that's a fraction of what's been proposed. I mean, that's just what I've dug up. Certainly if I did more research, I'm going to find more. As of 2023. So, you know, 54, Charlie McLean was around 110 during his article. It was 2016. And it's just a huge growth. These are operating distilleries. You know, we're looking at, there is a big demand, I know, around the world for this whiskey. I mean, Scotch from Scotland is still the best single malt on the planet as far as I'm concerned. That's my opinion. And I live here in Canada, and we do have some good distilleries. You can see them back here. McAloney's, Shelter Point, and I've got Glen Breton. I really believe that it's tough to see the canary in the mine. It's certainly tough for me to see it. I'm just curious what you think. So I'm going to finish it off with that question. You know, are we approaching another Whisky Loch? So anyways, I'm going to ask you to drink wisely, drink intelligently, and do not drink and drive. Until the next time, Slàinte.